This is what happens.
And we're live finally with our 167th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm the real Ken Johnson, at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey, everybody. As you can tell, we are being inundated with Kens today, so just get used to the idea. Welcome to another episode. We're super excited to be back. Ken and I spent last week in Nebraska, in Omaha for KernelCon. It was amazing. Like we taught classes, and I didn't have to ask if people could hear me before like they answered questions. You know, like it was all in person. Forget kind of what that high is like of actually being in person and around people. Everyone was super awkward because it had been a couple of years. Well, it was either that or we're all geeks. One of the two. I don't know, right? Like, you know, you win some, you lose some, whatever. But there has been a lot that's happening. We're excited to have Ken Toler on again with us today at Relotnek on Twitter, if I remember right.
That is right.
And yeah, Ken's going to we're going to have a discussion on all things crypto. He's been playing in that space from an AppSec perspective for a little while now. So we're going to dig in here shortly, but we did want to give props to KernelCon before we jump into it. Ken and I were saying how well it was run. I mean, Ken, you had some other, opinions there, like some observations that you wanted to add.
Oh yeah, no. So the venue was really awesome, and anytime we had any need whatsoever, it was like the actual like staff working that venue were awesome. The crew putting together KernelCon did a fantastic job. I was very impressed. My son Max, he loves the swag that I brought back, especially that flashlight. It's like a telescope feature on it, and then like you can bend the flashlight around. So we actually spent part of Sunday trying to learn the algorithms around Rubik's cubes that since they'd given us one of those. So yeah, it was really fun. So the venue, the swag, everything was really cool, well organized. The staff were really nice, and just honestly, just being able to train people in person was amazing. Like getting that live feedback, being able to have conversations during breaks, being able to just say, hey, call out the answer, having people do their readouts on the end of the second day in person where we get to see their notes and we get to ask questions and collaborate, just that real time. I forgot how great that is. It was wonderful. I loved it. And it was a good time. And I got some training in while I was out there of my own. I got to go get trained up at one of the local. Shout out to Omaha Academy of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You guys are awesome. They're never going to watch this podcast, but it was cool to go out there nonetheless. So yeah, good time, man. What'd you think overall?
Yeah, I mean, it feels strange because it's been so long that everything felt kind of new again, right? Getting in person, actually like the hallway con, right? Like we talked about this with a couple of people, just other security teams, people, speakers and attendees, but we've missed that just interactions outside of, hey, you're giving a talk and we're throwing questions at you in the comments or whatever else, but just the interaction was great to have. But they did a really good job of pulling that off, like providing those opportunities, supporting us as trainers, obviously. Like that was, we kind of live for that, or we have, right, in the past. And yeah, they just seem, it was incredibly well run. I told people before that they should go if they had an opportunity, right? Like we obviously had people that listened to the podcast that were there training with us. Adam and his team, or the guys from Contrast, Dave Lintner, who's been on the show before, was there as well. It was great to see those guys. But yeah, it's going to be one moving forward that I'm going to recommend everybody jump into, right? The content was great. The organizers did a good job. And they're going to outgrow the space they were in at that hotel pretty quickly, right? Like it wouldn't surprise me if they got a good 600 people there next year, just based on how things were run this year. So, yeah.
It was kind of funny. During the course, we're sitting there talking about mass assignment, and insecure object mapping and reflection, and at the same time, you're looking into getting reports of, and we saw it on our Slack chatter as well, perhaps the AppSec Slack, the Spring4Shell vulnerability. So it's just kind of funny, like as we're discussing these types of issues inside the course, sure enough, another one comes up, and weird timing, but kind of just shows, stuff just comes back around over and over again.
Yeah, it does, right? And we've got a really good write-up on that. The one from JFrog that we were looking at, or we were passing around today. So I'll drop that into the comments here pretty quick. But okay, so like Ken was saying, talking about talked about Ken, either one of you, right? Damn it. Ken's talked about this at some point, right? But like you're saying, like the mass assignment, the data binding attacks that are happening, and then the configuration. I explicitly remember we talked about this. I mean, it was the second day of the course, and everybody was still trying to figure out what the hell was going on with Spring4Shell, the Spring4Shell vulnerability. But we were talking about configuration and how Java makes it really easy to change configurations programmatically, right? And then you jump in, sarcasm. No, I mean, it sucks, like from trying to figure out where things actually affect the running instance, right? Because there are so many places to do it, whether that's XML files, whether you're extending out the configurators, what have you, right? But you can tweak all those configuration parameters based on the running instance. So it may not reflect in the XML files behind the scenes. But if you look at the Spring4Shell vulnerability or the exploit itself, one of the keys to it is that they're able to override Tomcat specific class loader attributes, change the access log file path to somewhere under the web root directory, and then push their shell up in order to run it, right? So they're taking advantage of both logging. What is that? The Crocs and socks of security, right? Like, Crocs and socks, baby. They're changing logging, they're changing some configuration, and then they're actually able to do basically it's a mass assignment or a data binding attack in order to execute that RCE, right? It's pretty novel and it's pretty clever. The problem is that it's kind of a baseline configuration that's in a lot of walkthroughs. So developers look at it, take it, implement it, and then they're vulnerable if they are running Tomcat in this specific configuration. So yeah, I mean, give that a read if you don't understand what's going on with the Spring4Shell vulnerability. It lays it out pretty easily. If you're not running Tomcat, you're probably not vulnerable to this. But if you're just hearing about it now, and you are running Tomcat, that could be a problem, right?
Yeah, I think you have to have. They talk about which conditions allow you to be vulnerable to this, like having Java 9 used, Java 9 SDK used, and a couple other things like you mentioned, Tomcat. So, but yeah, taking user input, creating code out of it, never a good thing, or rarely a good thing. So I have seen RC as a service, so there's that. But anyways, cool. So do you want to get into what we brought the other Ken on to discuss? Am I hearing that mic? No, I'm hearing some phone ringing.
There is some ringing.
Sorry, yes. Something was going on with me. Somebody was calling and it was screwing with my Bluetooth. Sorry, guys.
Probably about your extended car warranty service.
Yeah. It probably is. I need to get on that. Apparently it expires every 2 weeks based on the calls I get. So
yeah, your representative is Ken.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So speaking, so let's talk about what you're into these days. Speaking of the Kens, Ken Toler, what are you up to these days? I think one of the main things we're going to talk about today is sort of the crypto space work you've been doing. But yeah, if you could catch people up on, since the last time we spoke to you, what all you've been working on, and what's your interest currently?
Yeah, man. I mean, look, still application and cloud security mostly, but the focus has been, like you said, in the cryptocurrency space and in blockchain. And yeah, I mean, it's really interesting how much the skills overlap. And I've been working on that stuff for probably about a year and a half, mostly focused on Solana work and some of these, I guess, lesser known chains, although Solana's getting pretty popular now. Um, but yeah, still same kind of stuff: source code reviews, threat modeling, architecture reviews, things of that nature. Just making sure the development teams are working working on things securely, and keeping that development hygiene up. I think it's very interesting to see. You were just talking about it. We kind of come around the bend again, and we keep repeating the same mistakes. And I think that in the cryptocurrency space, it's no exception. It's like the newest, the latest hotness. More people are getting into it, and we are seeing a lot of similar things happen. Uh, Except everything moves faster, and I think that this is the fastest I've seen things move in a while. So, yeah, a lot of issues cropping up with that, but it's a super interesting space. There's a lot to learn. I mean, it's never an expert, always a student. So
Yeah.
I think that's where I'm living these days.
That article by Moxie where he talks about, basically building an NFT and abusing the whole concept of NFT, and it basically coming down to like, well, at the end of the day, it's still, this is still a client server relationship ultimately. And I think that's where, I'm super interested, is like, it sounds like even though there's obviously new considerations with the way that blockchain works and financial transactions thereof. However, everything that's sort of being built around that, the infrastructure around all of that, it sounds like from folks I've talked to, such as yourself and others that are kind of consulting on these things, like it's not, the infrastructure around all of it is still very much, traditional sort of security concerns that you would typically be concerned with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this pendulum that we're on in cryptocurrency and in blockchain where it's like, things were, when the internet sort of came around, we were sort of everything was the concept was kind of this decentralized space. People could post stuff and do all these kinds of things. And then, it became more and more centralized, and all these big companies started, all the social media companies and everything started to get controlled and whatever. And we've swung into this sort of idealistic decentralized space where everything should be decentralized. But I think that we're kind of like on this swing of, oh, well, let's go solve this problem. People are solving it with centralized infrastructure, and maybe it makes sense to decentralize some things and not decentralize others. And so there's this, I think we're still kind of figuring it out. And yes, you're right, like a lot of the same problems crop up. We have this public ledger. There's information on there that you may not want out there. Or how do you handle performance, or how do you handle logging and monitoring? You brought up. I think folks are trying to solve these issues in the space. And I recently, and I don't want to like call it any projects, but I was listening to someone actually looking to solve this problem for smart contracts, and saying that smart contract developers don't have an easy way to gain insights about whether or not something is being used correctly or not. And they're trying to build out this logging infrastructure for smart contracts in a way to provide insights to developers, and it's under centralized infrastructure. So, pulling
Yep.
information out of the chain. So a lot of the same problems exist, and then how we solve them, I think is gonna, we're gonna end up somewhere in the middle of these two, like decentralized and centralized architectures. I look at it kind of like as a platform, as a tool, and so make your use the tool to fill your what you're trying to do, not necessarily the other way around.
Yeah, I mean that's always been my biggest thing there, especially with blockchain, right? Like we have a lot of these companies that it's like they're trying to shoehorn blockchain into environments, into technologies, or whatever, into a space where it doesn't necessarily it doesn't solve anything, right?
Yeah.
So there's certain things. I mean, like great, you could create, a blockchain that just logs, right, like all the stuff out of your whatever, right? Like, but how expensive does that get, right? Like, what does that actually look like? Is it really a solution that would be useful and would make life easier for people? Like, if it was decentralized, right? What happens if we do have a decentralized log, right? Like, there's all sorts of issues that we can introduce there that don't necessarily, yeah, they make security worse and they make our life harder, right? That's
Yeah.
basically what it boils down to. But there is stuff that's really great about it, right? Like, you look at some of those dexes, like the decentralized exchanges, being able to pay people, person to person. But then I have a hard time, like, with some of the claims that people make about how, like, secure things are, or how it's going to solve, like, all the world's problems because I can pay somebody in, China using a dex, and, we can trade coins, right? Like, yeah, that's great, but do you really need to do that, right? Like, is that a problem that hasn't been solved? Yeah. Or that
Right.
has to be solved. Yeah.
I mean, we've seen these behaviors before, right? This is what I like. This is what fascinates me about blockchain as a technology, is that we saw the same thing happen with cloud. We saw the same thing happen with containers. We are still seeing it happen with Kubernetes. Like, overcomplicating things for just like the sake of complicating them, and it's happening in the blockchain space as well. So, like, understanding what you're trying to do is like a hugely important step, you would think, on the design side. And I think that is kind of where we are always sort of chasing that in security, is that we kind of get to the point where people are using this new technology, we interject this audit mechanism from a security side, like, we're just coming at it, oh, we'll analyze your code, we'll do this. And then slowly we start to shift into, like, okay, well, maybe we'll look at the design and like design it securely, and, like, let's think about the problems before we actually start implementing.
Yep.
And man, these things move so fast. Some of these projects are like 2 people, and it's bananas. Like,
It's Wild West. Yeah.
you talk about CTFs and hackathons, like, in the security space, and how things happen. Sometimes folks, like, go to these hackathons, build a product. I was talking to someone the other day. They spent like 16 hours a day for 3 weeks building this product, had a prototype, got funding from, another project. And then it was like on, a mainnet within a couple of months. And then the team is like 3 or 4 people. And they're like, all right, we're ready for the audit, and you're kind of like,
Are you
okay,
though?
yeah, here we go. And then
Some-
finding security people is just like, I mean, we're already at sort of a talent shortage. It's like finding people that are into that space, into that chain, or like have those practices is like enormously difficult. Yeah, I mean, just a constant race, super fast paced.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wild world.
Well, and I was gonna give a call out, actually. Like, one of the talks that I attended at KernelCon was Sam Curry. He did his whole talk on basically, analyzing blockchain, or analyzing Web3 companies, right, and Web3 properties. And every single one was, oh, well, I found XSS, and then I was able to pop the admin portal, and because it was all the traditional web app vulnerabilities, but we were using that to basically access like Web3 blockchain stuff. And like, so it wasn't necessarily the security of the blockchain itself that's being hacked or exploited. It's all the cruft that we put around it, right? It's a traditional, oh, we want to expose this through a web browser, now we can attack it. And then along those lines, Heather, InfoSec Anon, who we know, and she helped us out with one of the cons, right? Like, anyway, she gave a talk on,
created the artwork for one of those for, I want to say it was the Midwinter's Night, I thought.
Yeah. Yep. But she gave a talk as well, Heather did, on basically how do you keep yourself safe in a Web3 world. which it was pretty prescient, but pretty like it's all these up and coming technologies, what you actually use to access your wallets, how do you recognize what's a centralized exchange, who actually has control over your coins, and how do you know when there's a scam. It is a lot of what she talked about. And it was basically, yeah, most of this is a scam, right? There's all this stuff.
I didn't want to.
So be careful. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, you see a lot of the traditional attacks pop up, and I think it kind of comes down to what the developers care or don't care about. There's sort of these different personalities or different personas of developers that, depending on the type of project that's being developed, like, they might be, well, if it's a phishing attack, as an example, like, I mean, that's huge, right? The scams that come through like the Discord servers, and there's this,
Yep.
especially with NFT launches and all these launches and being the first to adopt this new technology, or kind of like be a part of those communities, is kind of instantly a call to action and instantly a sense of urgency. So from like a phishing perspective, you are just like set up to do whatever you'd like. I mean, just be there at the time and have your scam site ready, and kind of like go for it. And so I think that there is this pressure from the community that almost, if you fall for these things, it's ultimately, we do everything we can to try to tell you where the right links are and all this kind of stuff, but it's your fault, user, right? And so I think that when that responsibility starts to shift to more established organizations or companies, is when they'll start to care a bit more about how to protect users from that type of thing. And I think you're starting to see some tools pop up in the market around how to protect yourself, and and it's more end user kind of facing tools. And then whether or not there is some sort of centralized infrastructure that these people can be, or these organizations can be responsible for, to protect the user. And to your point, Seth, like one of the more recent bridge hacks was an infrastructure issue, right? Somebody kind of popped one of the nodes, was able to influence that, and basically just drain funds from wherever, just because it was a backdoor. And that was an infrastructure issue, and had nothing to do with the security of the blockchain itself or any of that. It was just like somebody popped a box, and that's normal stuff. So they didn't put the proper protections around that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to have these decentralized exchanges and be able to pass that money around, but then it does get pushed, like that security gets pushed from, okay, the bank that has traditionally been the store for your money, for your, for all of your digital currency, right? Because that's basically what USD or any of the main currencies are anymore, to, okay, your wallet now houses that. And we know that users just don't have the best hygiene, right? As far as like security and, making sure that they're using, proper passwords for number one, right? Like all that kind of stuff. Right. And the second that they get popped, then, there is the bridge where they have access to, massive amounts of funds, but from a targeted perspective, it feels like you could drain pretty easily. And then you add on top of that things like smart contracts, where they give certain control to an application or a smart contract that's running on the chain that could drain funds if it's so inclined, right? So there's so much going on. And I think this is what you were getting at, Ken, right? Is it's moving so fast. And that was going to be my next question to you is, okay, first of all, what do you mean by moving so fast? And then second, like two parts, right? Where do like traditional AppSec and security people start, right? Like, what is your recommendation for that? But, first off, why is it, or what is it that you mean by moving so fast?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple. I think the first thing that comes to mind when I talk about speed is how fast an idea goes from idea to production application.
Okay.
If you think of it in a traditional sense. And I've seen projects start and get deployed within a matter of like a couple of months, or even have a prototype on a dev net, probably within a couple of weeks. And so the kind of path to security there is typically like one or two people have an idea, they spin this thing up, they launch it, they want a security audit before it goes onto mainnet, they get the audit, and then there's this point in time that the audit is done where you're like, okay, you're there, we didn't find anything. But as like anyone in the security industry knows, is in a even in the slowest of slowest cases, that's still just a point in time audit. There's no kind of all it's really doing is saying, all right, we spent like whatever. Well, let's say we spent 6 weeks on it, really digging into like these smart contracts, and we found X amount of things, and you fixed it. Okay, go. If you are developing from like 0 to 100 in a couple of months, imagine what the next 2 months looks like. Like, how often are you auditing? So there's no because the focus is on this stamp of approval. I want to get an audit so that my users feel like they are using this in a safe way and that I have an audit provides almost a false sense of security because of how fast all of these things change, and they can change within a matter of weeks. Core functionality can be changed within a matter of weeks. And when you talk about the size of the team, 2 or 3 people, um, there's probably not a security person there. And if we talk about like what we kind of say in the security industry around, security people aren't there because they're necessarily better at security than the developer. They're there because the developer is focusing on delivering a product, and security is focused on making sure that that product it has robust controls and is safe and secure. And that's what they're looking for. So their job, their motivation is different. And so if you don't have somebody looking at it consistently and constantly, and even somebody skilled looking at it consistently and constantly from a security perspective, can you really be assured that it is secure for its lifetime? Probably not. And these things change every day. So it just, you look at the commits, it's like open source. It's like trying to keep up with open source with less security resources and less people.
How do they engage you? I mean, is that, I mean, like what, when you are first approached to help these companies out, let's start with who's the demographic, who's the driving force behind it? Is it the security team, or is it the engineers? Do they know exactly? So that's the first part, like who's typically approaching you from within these companies. And then the second part is like, is it, because you know how this goes. Sometimes people aren't really sure what they want. So sometimes they'll reach out to you and like you said, it'll be as broad as I want a security audit. And you're like, what? And they're like, well, we've got, and they'll start to usually lay out some tech or something. And in a normal case, not this, and not in the crypto space, just normally they'll say, oh, we got this infrastructure. Maybe these are the things we care about.
Totally.
Sometimes they know exactly what they want, but I'm curious with crypto, like who's your demographic usually within these companies? And then, how do they typically approach you? Do they know exactly what they want, or is it a mixture?
There's a lot bundled in there. And I think one of my favorite things about this community of developers is that most of the people that approach you are technical, are developers themselves, are engineers that are working on the product and have an intimate understanding of what they are trying to accomplish functionally. So they're usually the ones that are approaching you.
Okay.
And that's awesome because one, it means that like engineers are thinking about security, and they're coming to the table with like this idea that they want someone to tell them what's wrong with the product. And that's incredibly awesome. It's not like a compliance driven thing or anything like that. The downside is, you're right. The vast majority of these folks, especially small projects, don't know what they're looking for. So they are looking for what the community tells them they need, which is a security audit or a pen test. And those things are kind of loosely defined and are probably dependent on the project. So, you might have this kind of, maybe there is some infrastructure, a database, and a custodial wallet or something like that, and they want a pen test. That kind of makes sense. But if they like come to you with like a 1,500 line smart contract and they're like, we want a pen test, you're kind of like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? And the tooling may or may not be available, or might be something that you have to kind of custom make as you're going. And so they don't really know, and they're looking for expertise from the security community on what they need. And we're slowly changing the terminology, the narrative of like what that looks like. But I think that there is no consistent terminology across security vendors inside of the space to be able to say, what's a pen test in this space? What's a code review in this space? What is an audit in this space? And that's where I think people get hung up. I would say that the crypto community, the blockchain community, is hyper aware of security, even if they're not necessarily intimately knowledgeable about what that means.
I always assumed that, and it's funny because you mentioned that the folks, building, the people you're working with, they're technology, their job is in tech, they're tech focused, and obviously they're somewhat aware of security, or at least that there's a need. But there's a couple interesting concepts. One is that there isn't a ton of regulation, whereas like with traditional, we've all done consulting for financial services companies. Quite a bit of regulation there, quite a bit of things you specifically have to do. Less regulation in this space, but I've always wondered too, like the user base, because we talked about phishing being an issue. And I mean, even technical people can get, obviously technical people can get phished all the time, and get scammed all the time. But it does seem like the user base, at least on the surface for crypto related activities, seems like it would have more of a technical bend to the user base. But then, I also think about stuff like a Coinbase, where anybody can go in there, sign up, buy and sell and trade crypto. So it seems like it might be a mix. But yeah, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of regulation, and there's much for you to. It feels like you're kind of making things up as you go, similar to how AppSec was when we started, where we're just sort of like piecing things together that we know are vulnerabilities, and maybe there's some tools out there, that are free, that people are starting to hack on and work on. But the Wild West essentially is what it felt like, and this feels similar.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're totally right. The user base, it is the Wild West because the user base varies depending on where folks are coming into the community, right? I mean, there are a lot of discussions in cryptocurrency around how to make it more accessible to the everyday user, right? In the same way that companies like Robinhood make trading more accessible to the everyday user. Does that means like mobile applications, or how do we bring browser wallets into mobile to make that user experience a bit better? Because from a product design perspective, we're talking about making it more accessible. So I think that as that becomes more commonplace, that the like exposure to the everyday user happens, like we're going to see more and more of these same security flaws, phishing or social engineering happen in more technical spaces like trading or NFTs or being on a drop or something like that. There's also like these incredibly intelligent folks coming from the finance space, options trading, derivatives and stocks and all that kind of stuff, that are following these markets that are very technical, but in a different space. And so there's this weird juxtaposition of skills between, like fraud, finance, development, engineering, cloud, infrastructure, that creates this space of like, you can be technically knowledgeable in one area of this and be effective, to kind of go back to, what you were talking about, Seth, around like, where do people start? There are a lot of places to start in cryptocurrency and in blockchain. And I think that is kind of why, right? You could actually come from like a bank fraud team that is just looking for patterns of how people exploit equations, math, whatever, and have a space in this in cryptocurrency and blockchain. Because I think eventually, once the incident response and fraud awareness becomes more commonplace, you're going to need those people that are on the lookout for that stuff, and being able to identify these same types of patterns in this blockchain ecosystem, right? In this cryptocurrency ecosystem. You're also going to need cloud people,
Yeah.
So,
and factor. Wow.
Well, and I was going to say, like, there traditionally some of that, like some of that fraud, some of that detection, specifically to that point, Ken, has all been hidden behind the curtain, right? Like, so you have banks and you have communities that like are watching for that sort of thing. Nowadays, it's all public on the blockchain, right? Like you look at that most recent bridge attack, and they've frozen that wallet from being able to do anything where the funds ended up, right? So there's, $500 million that's sitting in this wallet the guy can't get at, but it's all public. Like you can go out and see like what's actually going on and how much is owned by all these different resources. Whereas traditionally it was all hidden. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays into it. Like as some of those people come out of the woodwork, so to say,
And
and
that changes your
get
incident
involved.
response teams completely. Like that's a whole different, because normally, your abuse teams are, to your point, Seth, like your abuse teams are, both incident response and abuse. It's like, it can be pretty behind the curtains in terms of like some of that stuff. I know our abuse team works on very specific things to our ecosystem and our platform, right? So they're not doing stuff that you might see elsewhere. It's not the same at it's not the same at GitHub as you would see maybe at Twitter, we'll say, right? So, however, in this case, you're going to be dealing with very like similar abuse cases around, but then in terms of there being people trained up to actually deal with this and actually handle incidents at like 2:00 in the morning and do that, that variant analysis, what we call variant analysis, finding other variations of the same vulnerability. Man, that's just a whole, it feels like it would be a whole lift and shift. Like you'd really need to start now a while back, I guess, building out like what that looks like, because nobody's
but we
up,
always
right?
come into it. Yeah, we always come into it after, right? So,
Yeah.
to Ken's point, as far as like what we did with cloud, right? How long did it take us to really get some good tech in place that would monitor cloud configurations for security controls, right? And yes, there's certain things that the blockchain and these companies do well from a security perspective because it's designed into those components, but the ones surrounding it, like incident response, like you're saying, Ken, like, are we really monitoring that? Like, what is Binance or, some of these, bigger exchanges, what do they do to watch for fraud? Because we're very reactive now. Like you watch the space in the news and it's like, oh crap, somebody just stole $1 billion. Maybe we should go do something about that. Right. Like that's traditionally what the articles say. And like, we're just not ahead of it yet. And then it also comes down to things like, okay, people are putting all these smart contracts on the networks. Is anyone auditing those? Like, it's almost like a package repository, Ken, right? Like, we've got NPM, we've got all these smart contracts that are running on Solana or whatever else. Are those all audited for security? Because people just keep adding to that list. And you can fork it because you can see what the actual code is, and then you can make changes to it and issue your own smart contract that's going to different wallets and going to different places and has different, variants or, invariants and different conditions built into when it actually transfers money. And no one's looking at that. There's not a good way there's no centralized authority that's taking care of that, right? Like
we're still trying to secure packages being uploaded to these ecosystems and struggling. So
there are, I think that part of it is we are, if you look at on the Ethereum side, there's like Open Zeppelin and these frameworks, and you're starting to see frameworks pop up in Solana with, Anchor. But again, there is this, it just moves so fast that you are, the versions change. I mean, there's like a running joke that by the time you've updated to, the latest version of the CLI to build your smart contract, the next one's out. And so you're constantly trying to catch up with these new methods because folks are really trying to secure it earlier in the process and provide some scaffolding and guardrails around how to, put these things out in a secure way. But maybe the documentation's behind, or folks don't know how to use it, or they're not trained. And so it just becomes, a constant fight of getting that information out there and making sure that it's consistent and accurate in this huge open source community. that is ever evolving and ever changing, and it's incredibly fun. But it is a real challenge, and I think all of the concepts we talk about in terms of making sure that we are involved in those conversations is probably the most exciting part for me, because engineers want it too. They want it
Yeah.
to. They want an easy way to make these things secure, and they want their stuff audited. They want it done. They want the feedback. I mean, I would say that the really cool thing is that when we deliver a report, those things get fixed. Every single issue from high to low, most of the time, gets fixed or is addressed, right? Because they want to, and it happens within like a couple of weeks or whatever. If it's a systemic issue, maybe longer. But I'm really impressed by the community's willingness to take the report, take feedback, and act on it. Which in traditional AppSec, I'm always kind of like fighting, report findings. Well, can you lower the severity of this, or
Yeah.
that kind of thing? And this is just like, okay, why is it high, or why is it medium? All right, cool, we get that. Like, we're gonna go fix it, and they just go and do it. And that's like an incredible feeling, incredible
It
relationship to have with
it, al-
development teams.
it almost seems like regulation and compliance not being a thing sadly makes the focus on security more real.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it's so
exactly.
messed up, but it's hilarious to think about.
It is. It's so different. It's a different way of engaging, and folks are awesome. I think that there's also there's a bit of I don't know how to really describe it, but the interesting thing is there's a huge push to making sure that everything is open source. That's a big debate in the community, like closed source versus open source, and the kind of security through obscurity argument, and that whole thing gets mixed up in there. And so a lot of what it comes down to is folks are like, well, if it's open source, someone can audit it, and it's the responsibility of the user to review what they are using. And it's kind of this weird place to be, because you get both sides of the argument, but you're kind of like, well, the user. I mean, are you trying to exclude everyone that doesn't know how to read code from this ecosystem? And I think that that's not where the whole community wants to go. So there's this battle between exposure and sort of technical aptitude that is a really interesting, dynamic dichotomy, whatever, between what is being developed and what is being used. That makes it kind of another interesting thing to look at from a security perspective, in terms of how do we not only educate engineers and developers, but maybe educate users and what to look for, because now it's exposed to them, and when they make a decision to use a new contract, the whole thing is you can look at the code yourself. So how do we enable them to make that code easy to read, or make it easy to audit at a high level, or determine whether it's safe or secure or robust? Where does that exist without a central authority, right? How do we do that?
Yeah, that was exactly where I was going to go, was the central authority, right? It's the trust issue. Like it's fascinating, because we've taken again, with the exchanges, we've taken the bank out of the picture as we're executing financial transactions, right? Or we're like buying NFTs, right? Like we're buying art or whatever else is represented by that NFT. So instead of trusting that the bank or whatever else is, has your best interest as the third party that's receiving or transferring those funds, you are trusting the developers themselves, and that's it. Right? Like, I mean, trying to read some of that code, if you've never seen JavaScript before, or like code on, from a whatever perspective, you'll recognize some words, and that's about it, right? At some point we should do an exercise and just giving someone a smart contract, like not a technical person, somebody outside of that circle, and saying, hey, would you use this? Because their eyes are just going to glaze over, and they're going to be like, well, what does it do for me? And we're like, well, you have to figure that out, right? They say that it does X, Y, and Z. Like, we can give them that much, but there could be other stuff in there. Yeah, it's the trust issue is huge.
Yeah. It's wild, and it's almost like you kind of I wonder, how do you make it easier to read, or how do we provide that that sort of stamp of approval, or on process or procedure? And I think we're only going to figure that out as organizations and companies mature and the space matures. But one of the rays of hope I have is that engineers are willing to sort of listen to security folks and say, yeah, I mean, we should be doing these things. So getting something into like a CI/CD pipeline or an automated um, scan, or like putting all that stuff in, is really just a matter of us as like engineers helping to develop these tools to put in place, and then the effort to get them in place is probably much lighter than it would be in a corporate environment. It's just that we have to like focus on doing that while also auditing all of these projects, and there's just the people problem and everything else. So it's yeah, like I said, speed. It's moving too fast for us, but we're doing our best.
You should make an NFT stamp of approval that you hand
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah, just
So
it's
what we're gonna create a chain, and we'll only mint NFTs when we decide that a contract is secure. Is that what I'm
Yeah.
hearing? Right?
yeah.
Sounds good. Yeah.
They
What
just
are
have
the
to pay.
Yeah, they just have to pay, exactly. What are the, sort of common things you're used to seeing? Like, if you can, I don't know what you can speak to and what you cannot, but in a general sense, in the using vagary. What's that?
So I was gonna say, tell me how many unit tests I've actually seen on chain. Never mind.
Oh
Yeah.
gosh, yeah.
There
let's start
are a
there.
lot of unit tests actually.
Really?
Yeah, I would say the funny thing is that especially with things that are written in Rust, they may not be the most robust unit tests, but I've seen a lot of unit tests, and I've seen a lot of tests built, especially in the framework for Anchor, around like, what is this intended to do? We expect this to
Nice.
happen, and they run the test, and all the tests need to pass. And a lot of our initial conversations with some of these projects are, hey, we can't get the test to run, or we can't get the test to pass. It's almost like a table stakes initial conversation right after sort of, what does this do, and what don't we understand about it. So I do see unit tests, and I'm happy to say that like it's more common, not common,
Yep.
but I would say more common.
Well, and I know from talking to Stefan, like Logical as well, right? Like the fuzzing aspect of like actually testing out blockchain code and smart contract code using things like AFL, like the different fuzzers that are built, is out there. I mean, if you look at Bitcoin code in and of itself, it has like test functionality built into it to fuzz it, right? Like that's just a part of what they provide on top of, hey, here's the normal unit and integration test to make sure that Bitcoin is functioning as expected. And so, like, I mean, it was tongue in cheek, right? But the fact that it's actually there gives me a little bit more assurance, I guess. But anyway, sorry, Ken asked a different question and I totally like sidelined it. So
The other interesting thing about the unit tests built into these frameworks is they can be used to sort of play with input, because a lot of, especially on newer chains, you don't have a way to test dynamically. So the unit test can be manipulated and used to generate your own fail and test scenarios. So sometimes if you're doing an audit and you're like, oh, I recognize that I found this issue, you can write that unit test relatively easily as an engineer and put that in there. Or you can use it to, I don't want to call it dynamic testing, but to kind of put some sort of arbitrary input through the project if you can't actually do it on the chain or on a development environment. And that's the testing thing is kind of nice to see. So
yep. Well, so what other issues then are you seeing, right, on like, do you have like a most common, come up with your own like blockchain top 10, Ken? Let's do that.
We all like checklists.
Yes.
I was actually searching for that ahead of this podcast episode to see if there was like a crypto top 10. I didn't come up with anything. There were like various lists about securing your crypto assets, but yeah, not a crypto top 10, so to speak, that I could find.
I mean, the place to look, I think, if you're just looking for like a list of vulnerabilities, probably SWC registry. If you're looking at Solidity stuff, SWC registry has like a list of things that were found and some examples and stuff like that. But I would say a lot of it comes down to what you would typically expect: access control, tampering with input, and like not validating some of that stuff. A lot of it comes down to that, I think, or the most common things like failing to put a constraint around a particular method, because the way that the way that contracts kind of manifest, especially in more simpler projects, is it's a set of methods. It's basically like almost, I know it's not, it's not object oriented, but it's like a class, right? It's like there's a method there that's going to be used, and anyone has access to generate this transaction and send it to the chain and drop it on there. And so it's being able to control that in some way and follow those practices around access control. And a lot of times those are missing. And so there's just these unforeseen issues, or there's a validation that's happening that is inaccurate, or doesn't do what you're expecting it to do, or can be bypassed. So a lot of it is logic. And the other big pieces are like algorithm and logic based, like business logic. You intended to do this thing, and we found a way to bypass or game the system in this way, are probably the most common. But I think that the frameworks are trying to help reduce some of those things. One of the recent ones I saw, it's not super recent that it was implemented, but you know how React has that like unsanitized whatever, like helps developers understand. I can't remember what the full method is, but it's like
Dangerously
use things
set
unsafe.
under
You are
HTML.
doing a bad thing right now, kind of stuff. So one of the recommendations in these frameworks is to sort of identify unchecked values, like unchecked accounts, as unchecked, rather than use this generic like account info object. And so it's basically saying, look, we know that this is unchecked. We're putting it in here as unchecked. So as an auditor, you can go in and say, okay, I know that these values are unchecked, and is that appropriate in this scenario, or is there anything that I can look at, for that, versus like a checked account or a validated account. So it's also encouraging developers to think like, okay, I'm using something that's unchecked. I need to be careful with this. So that stuff is starting to happen in frameworks on Solana, which is super cool. And then easier ways to establish access controls through decorators and stuff is also happening there.
Cool. Yeah, we were dropping some links in, so we're a little distracted, Ken.
No worries, dropping links.
Yes.
Yeah, it's funny. In our course, we actually brought up how often the patterns are not clear in these frameworks, and just in frameworks in general. We use React as like the example of what you can do right, but we definitely, we're talking about, hey, a lot of these methods, they're not named correctly, and they're unsafe, and they lead you to believe that's not the case. And it's not always clear. Yeah. So,
and I think, in an open source project, which a lot of these are, even if you have those things available, how it's kind of the question of how you enforce development standards or practices with your team when it's so distributed, and you're bringing in new blood all the time, right? And people are rotating in and out, and there's even kind of this idea of paying development teams in a decentralized way based on their contributions to the project. And so they'll basically, there's ideas around payroll, like you submit these lines, and you through this algorithm you're paid based on your contribution to the work, which is like a super cool idea. But then you're sort of like, well, how do you control the security and quality of this code? And it's just like such a weird and interesting problem to think through.
That's actually been my biggest pet peeve, is hearing how often now this is not just in the crypto space. This is also in, and this is probably what makes me equally, if not slightly more uncomfortable, is in the DoD space for the United States government, DoD, where people, because it's a business, they want to maximize their profit. They don't necessarily want to spend the it's not just the salary of developers, right? It's also like there's other costs associated with it. It can be pretty expensive if you don't outsource. But then you see these companies outsource a lot of this development to countries that have for sure active counterintelligence against our own. We all live in the U.S., so You know, we're under the U.S. government's blanket here, right? So you see, I guess this is one thing I was going to mention that makes me uncomfortable about this space is that I see a lot of things being sent to these countries that we know have, you know, essentially a Cold War-esque cyber, and I'm using the term cyber. I know I'm a fraud, but I'm using the term cyber. You know, active cybersecurity warfare kind of going on, like a Cold Warfare type deal going on, and we're just saying, hey, like, here, develop code for us. That seems to be pretty dicey. That seems like that's a huge conflict of interest. It definitely makes me nervous, and I understand the need to cut costs, or I understand the desire, not the need to cut costs, but that seems like that's like the worst place to cut costs. I don't know. What do you guys think about this? Am I off base here?
No, but
is this a trend you also have seen? I mean,
the thing is, though, I mean, what I love about it is that the motivation is the polar opposite. Really, they're like, we will pay whatever as long as we get really good, like, fast development teams, right? Because if you think of, like, in some cases, these projects are like printing money, you know?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's like, and not like in any nefarious way, but because they are gathering so much support that it drives the price of the crypto up and whatever it might be. But they're funded by other projects that have this, and they see a need for this in the market, and they're like, yes, like, we want this, and so we'll pay development teams or whatever it might be to do what that we need to do. And that's an incredible motivation. It's just, you have all the problems you just described.
And so it's a speed thing more so than or talent thing more so than a desire to cut costs. Because I definitely know when I've seen it in the DoD space, the federal space, it's 100% to cut costs. They're like, the government's willing to pay for this product, but you know, we're gonna outsource it to XYZ country. I'm not gonna name any specific countries. I don't need that in my life right now. But so I'm not gonna call out any specific countries, but you know, let's say I'm an outsider and you're like, wow, that's really, are you sure? What is this thing doing? Oh God, why are you really, have you not thought through the considerations there? But like, so that's interesting. So it's more of just like a talent thing and like a speed of development.
It's not even, it's just talent. It's not even speed. It's just, we want whoever wants to work on this project and is interested in it. We, you know, I'm not saying we as in me, but like the colloquial we is that we don't care where you live. We want you to develop if you have a passion for it and go for it. And that's and they want to pay people to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I would also say probably it's experience related, right? Like, you know, so the industry in and of itself has taken a few years to come up to speed, but where are the people that were interested in it and actually developing smart contracts and developing blockchain and distributed apps and everything like that? A lot of it were in those countries where that was the only way, that was the most interesting thing for some of these technologists to actually work on, right? And so they've got the experience, they've developed these platforms and these ways to actually, you know, get involved. And so naturally they're the first ones up. If you want somebody that's already built a distributed app who knows how to do X, Y, and Z, you're going to turn to those people that have those expertise. And some of them aren't coming from a traditional background. I mean, here in the States, most of the people that, you know, are living, you know, that are technologists, that are software engineers have probably been snapped up by Facebook and Google and Apple, right? Like the top talent, that's where they've gone, as opposed to these other locations where they just didn't have that opportunity. So,
exactly.
so there, there's a balance that's there. And to Ken's point, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, right? Like, especially where it's public, right? Most of these projects are open source. We should be able to audit those and then have a security person actually take a look at it.
And that brings up a good question. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, and it could be lucrative for security folks too. Like, if you feel like you have the chops to go and do it, the bug bounty programs for some of these projects are ridiculous. I mean, we're talking like in the millions if you can find something that's low level enough on like a layer 1 chain, you know? And so I don't think that the community in general is afraid of money, mostly because it's not fiat. So, you know, it's kind of like a weird scenario to be in, but but yeah, it's like, there is a kind of like prove your metal kind of aspect to being able to contribute in the space. And I think there are a variety of ways that you can do that, whether it's on an assessment team or individually, to help out. And I think that, kind of going back to your point, Ken, first Ken,
Other
is
Ken.
other Ken, is that, I think that there's this concept that you need to be incredibly technical, and there are folks that are doing that. I mean, like that are looking at very low level things, but you can also sort of be somebody that's coming from cloud security that wants to be involved in the space, because there are elements of that as well that I think kind of fly under the radar and will become more important as this all levels out, I think, or in the fraud space, or just in the, just in the ideas of like, how do we help fulfill this, and monitoring, right? How do we establish a good way to monitor this over time, or incident response, or things like that? So it's yeah, I mean, it's like one of the oysters, I think, of trying to sort of find your way from the security side, and all of our skills, no matter where you are in security, translate in some way, I think.
Yeah. Yep.
What are the common tech stacks that you see? I mean, you've mentioned Anchor, you've mentioned the Rust programming language. Yeah, is Rust kind of the primary language you're working with these days?
Yeah.
I assume no Ruby. That's a joke. That's a joke.
I mean, I have worked on a Ruby application inside of the crypto space, but I won't go beyond that. But there is,
sure.
So I would say that the tech stacks vary. I definitely am working mostly in Rust right now, because most of Solana's in Rust, and that's been my the primary viewpoint for me for a little over a year. But there are a variety of languages that are and frameworks that are being built out. So Anchor is one of them on the Solana space, but obviously Solidity and Ethereum is a language that we see a lot of, or Teal on the sort of algo side. But I would say the tech stacks, the one thing that is consistent across the board is probably JavaScript and React, because all of the clients, at least right now, or most of them, are built with that SDK, right? Just to kind of like hit the API node or whatever. So I think if you are a JavaScript developer, or you're really used to looking at stuff in JavaScript, React, or Node, you can really very well play in this space.
That all translates over, like you said. I mean, it's pretty. I mean, yeah, I was thinking it would have to be pretty performant, systems to perform anything. Time you're dealing with like a ton of financial transactions, performance is always pretty critical there. Which you guys have mentioned and kind of talked about auditing many times, but how is auditing looking? Most of the time. I mean, the reason I say this, I know there was some confusion when we had listed an article. I don't know, within the last couple of months, one of these episodes we had talked about. I don't know, it was either 250 or 350 million, something like that, stolen, but there was no real there was no paper trail. There was nothing. It was very difficult for anyone to figure out what exactly had happened. And it feels like it's, an auditing issue for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is that it's kind of like, okay, let's make a comparison to cloud. Like, remember how hard it was to look at CloudTrail, like in the early days, like trying to make sense of what the hell was going on, or whether there was a security issue, or like trying to figure out CloudWatch and figure all that out. And now we have all these tools and stuff available that make that a lot easier, and there's Splunk integrations and whatever. I think we're in a similar space where like the information is there, but there aren't a lot of, or at least I'm not aware of a lot of products that's collecting all that information and exposing it easily. Or even if they are, the queries aren't necessarily security driven. They're more like analytics driven, or like what's new in the market, or how are we going to predict the next, big token or NFT drop, or whatever it is. It's more like data analytics. So I think that once a security firm cracks the nut on like, all right, well, here's how we take all of the information in, and we're examining the entire chain, and we're able to like have this live feed and generate alerts off of that, that's going to be a big win. There are some that are doing this type of data analytics. There's an interesting project on the called Flipside that basically bug bounties data queries to their user base to be like, hey, we need to know this change of how this token has performed over the last 3 months compared to this other obscure metric or whatever. And then they'll put a bounty out, and they'll take all these queries from these folks and reward them all in cryptocurrency, and then come back to it and be like, all right, this person had the top answer, and so we give them a bigger bounty. So it's an interesting way to incentivize the community to help with data analytics. I don't know. I think there's a lot of ideas out there that we can hone in on, but data collection and incident response and gathering that info and analytics is it's not quite there, I don't think.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, or one thing that we have in our back pocket is the fact that all these, or most of the chains, are public, right? So even if we don't know exactly what's going on right now, we can go replay that entire chain and everything that happened on it.
Yep.
Right? If you look at some of the block explorers and what actually goes on within the chains, so there's a lot of data to play with, and somebody's going to crack it eventually, right? Like how to monitor those chains for security incidents or like anomalies, and it'd be an interesting space to play in for sure.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, you can always go back. That is just a super cool.
That's the point, right?
Yeah. And so once you do, you're like, oh man, let me go look at all the things we didn't notice, 10 years ago.
Yep.
So that'll be cool.
Yeah, it'll be interesting when when those tools do start to come out. Well, good. I mean, Ken, we've been going for an hour, or Ken's, we've been going for an hour. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. It feels like we could keep this discussion going, and I think we should have a follow-up, right? We didn't even get into the whole NFT space, really. We've been pretty, focused on blockchain stuff, and there's just so much going on in that industry in general.
Yeah.
That I would like to continue the conversation at some point, maybe in a month or so. If you're willing to come back and keep having the discussion, Ken, let's do it.
I want a Ken Toler NFT stamp of approval.
Yes. Yeah.
It'll only cost you like $1 million.
Yeah.
Worth it.
That's true. We need our own security chain where we give out NFTs for audits, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So they know who to blame, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're just gonna put Ken Toler's name on everything. Yes.
Yeah.
Here's his private wallet address. Don't worry about it.
Oh, good Lord.
Anyway. Yeah. So we appreciate the time, Ken. We'll just any last minute thoughts before we close out this week, as far as where to start, if someone's interested, anything that you could recommend there before we say goodbye.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I want everyone to leave in the security side is that there is a place for you in the cryptocurrency world if you feel like it's technically unattainable. Trust me, once you start getting into it, you'll realize that there's a lot of places that you can go. And as far as where to start, just there's so many resources right now in terms of developing smart contracts. I think you dropped a couple in there. There's the Open Zeppelin stuff. There's I saw the not so smart contracts hop in there. There's Ethernaut, to just go and get an idea of how to work in these places and break stuff, just like we do, in the Portswigger Web Academy or whatever. Pick your favorite Udemy course. Just get your hands on it, and that's the fastest way to learn, in my opinion. And once you do that, I think you'll realize, okay, it's not as hard as I thought.
Yep. Cool. Well, good deal. Yeah, we will be back next week. If you have more questions for Ken Toler, he is in our Slack channel, and I'm sure there's others in there that also have experience in the cryptocurrency space. We'd love to continue the conversation, so join Slack. Let us know what your experiences are in the space, and what you're interested in. And that would be great. Otherwise, we'll be back next week. Ken, CK Tricky Ken, anything else that you want to add for today before we close it out?
No, just appreciative of your time, Ken Toler. And then I just want to reiterate, huge appreciation to the people that attended our course at KernelCon, to the KernelCon organizers themselves. And I will tease out that we did, Seth and I, take a little time during this trip to film various parts of it so that you, as the viewer, can see kind of behind the scenes of what it's like to travel to a conference and give training and go to speaker parties, and yeah, just we gave a little behind the scenes footage there. So look for that video coming out as well.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate the time you took with me.
Thank you.
Thanks for the insight, Ken. All right, we'll see everybody next week. Thanks.
Later.
See ya.
And if I could figure out how to turn this off, guys, I'll end the broadcast. All right, later. Bye, everyone.